Welcome back. I'm Clay Lowry, Executive Vice President at the Institute of International Finance. And before we start this next panel, I want to say this. We try to say it every time, which is that if you have questions that you would like to get in, we would like to receive them. They should be at the bottom of your panel. We are going to be talking in the next 45 minutes about the European Union in kind of the international order. It's led by, obviously COVID-19 is hitting us, but there are a number of different aspects that are kind of important right now. The one that probably gathers a lot of the attention is Brexit. There's a discussion that's going on that's taking place right now as we speak. There's been a series of negotiations, but beyond that is the relationship between the EU and the United States. And hopefully, if we have time, maybe a little bit, the relationship between EU and China and other countries as well. But with no further ado, let me introduce who we have here on the panel. We have from the European Commission's Director of Task Force for Relationships with the UK, Paulina Demek-Hack. She's been with the European Commission since 2004 in a variety of jobs, including being a financial advisor to former President Juncker. In addition, we have Martine Doyen from the Goldman Sachs. She's been with Goldman Sachs since 2012. Martine actually has served in government jobs, both with the UK's FSA and also with the Canadian Finance Ministry and the Bank of Canada. And then finally, we have David O'Sullivan, who is a longtime career official with the European Commission, including being the Director General for Trade, which is obviously very important during these discussions, and also a former Chief of Staff to European Commission President Prodi, and then most lately as the EU's ambassador to the United States. He now serves as a senior counselor for the law firm Steptoe & Johnson. So let me start off with Paulina as the only official sector person talking to us today. And what I wanted to talk to you about is the issue that you have to deal with every day, which is Brexit. Maybe you can provide a bit of an update on what the negotiation looks like to date and kind of your thoughts on the prospects going forward. Again, thank you all for joining us. Paulina?
Thank you very much, and very happy to join you this afternoon. And good afternoon to everyone who is watching this. So briefly on where are we on these negotiations? As you mentioned already, of course, taking place in a context which is complicated given the general situation of COVID-19. We have had 3 rounds of negotiations, the 2 last ones by video conference for obvious reasons, and we are heading into our 4th negotiation round next week. Where do we stand? I think it's fair to say that we have probably at this stage not made as much progress as one would maybe had hoped. The EU chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, had the opportunity to give a press conference after the last round, which is 2 weeks ago, where he observed that there is still quite some differences between the positions of the EU and the UK. Our UK friends and partners, I think, came to a very similar conclusion that we are still quite far apart. If we look at on the substance, on the various issues from the EU side, we still see as a starting point the political declaration, which was a political document agreed between the EU and Boris Johnson and his government back in October last year, which sets out, if you wish, the parameters of the future relationship, the relationship we are now working on. The European Commission has a mandate from the EU 27, from the EU member states, which set out in quite some detail what we would want to achieve in the future partnership. Now, if we look at which are the issues which have been the most difficult ones so far, they are in particular related to fisheries. So the future fishing opportunities between the EU and the UK. We have also, let's say, quite some differences on the area of what we call the level playing field, which has to do with fair competition conditions for companies on both sides of the channel. So basically that we would commit ourselves on both sides to keep high standards on the environment, on climate, on the fight against climate change, on social and labor issues, on tax, on state aid and competition. And then the third issue where we are quite far apart is what we tend to refer to as governance, which is our EU approach. What our mandate says is that we want to have a comprehensive agreement covering a large range of areas, ranging from free trading goods and services to energy, to transport, to internal security, and many other matters. And this is kind of the comprehensive approach with an overarching architecture that we would want to achieve in this future partnership. Now, as I mentioned, discussions will continue next week. We of course hope for let's say a good momentum in these discussions, and we will then have to take stock and see where we are at the end of next week.
Thank you very much. And David, let me turn to you. You've done trade agreements in the past. I mean, from an outsider's perspective, it seems to me that we saw the UK put out kind of its trade language, its text, so to speak, which is actually sort of similar to the way you would see a lot of trade negotiations going forward. At least, you know, for somebody who grew up in the United States, that's how kind of the US seems to do it. And sort of in that respect, it's approaching the trade agreement almost like, hey, we're Canada and we're going to try to do a trade agreement with the EU. But obviously, they're not Canada. It's a big economy that's right next to the EU. It's much more integrated. And so do you see this kind of dynamic creating problems going forward between the UK and the EU? And what's your take, I guess, on how the negotiations seem to be going?
Well, I mean, both sides have actually put their texts on the table. In fact, the EU, as is always its tendency and practice, put a draft text on the table even before the UK did. So, I mean, both sides have laid out what they would like to see, which is normal. And in some ways, I'm not particularly surprised that after only 3 rounds of negotiations, we're still quite far apart. This is normal. What is unusual about this negotiation is, firstly, that normally a negotiation is about trying to bring people who are very far apart closer together, or who are moderately far apart closer together. This is a situation where we have perfect integration, or we had perfect integration, we still have for the duration of the transition period, and we are trying to negotiate an imperfect second best, which is a less integration. So it's instead of it being the Tour de France, it's more like a slow bicycle race. So it's the opposite of a classic negotiation. Now, okay, that is what it is, and we are there. But I think the real issue, and this is the elephant in the room, is time. You mentioned Canada. Well, I think the UK doesn't just want Canada. What they've put out is actually they'd like a bit of Canada, they'd like a bit of Japan, they'd like a bit of Norway, they'd like a bit of Switzerland. Fair enough. I mean, perfectly reasonable. If I were the UK, I'd do the same thing. But these things have taken time. I negotiated with South Korea. It was 2.5 years. The agreement with Canada, as we now all famously know, took about 8 years. The negotiation with Japan, similarly, 7 or 8 years. So maybe we can do this in 1 year or 2 years. I don't believe, to be very frank, that you can do it in 11 months. And I think this is the real core of the problem. And it is the UK which has said this must be done in this time frame. And I think it's mission impossible, to be quite frank, to have the complexity of this negotiation. The final point I would make, which I think is important, is though last year nobody talked about anything in Brussels except Brexit. To be frank, these days people rarely talk about Brexit. There are so many other issues. President von der Leyen today is presenting the Commission's revised budgetary proposals for the post-COVID-19. This is the issue in Europe today. It is about the health crisis, the public health crisis, the economic consequences, finding our way out of that. Of course, relations with the UK will be hugely important, but it has dropped down the political agenda, and there is not the same sense of priority. There can't be, because it's crowded out by other things at this point. And the combination of that and the time constraint makes this a very, very difficult negotiation.
Okay, so that's not encouraging for the short time window that's been provided. So, all right, Martine, let me turn to you. So you sit with a global financial services firm that is based in the UK, though you obviously do a lot of work and you have offices all over the EU. How do you see these negotiations from your perspective as from a financial services firm perspective?
Thank you very much, Clay, and thank you for inviting me. Well, let me share with you a few observations. What I would say first is that firms have been preparing for Brexit for a long time. The baseline scenario we've been working on, and that was one that was given to us by regulators, which made sense, was to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. Of course, this is not what market participants, whether it's us, firms, or clients, want. What we hope is an arrangement which will maintain access to each other's market. What have we been doing over the past few years? We have been scaling up operations in Europe. We have been repapering clients to European entities, increasing connectivity to financial market infrastructure, relocating staff, etc., etc. So that's what has been happening for years. Now, what I'd like to note, what is very interesting, is that in spite of the fact that the Brexit process has been ongoing for quite some time, liquidity hasn't fragmented in a significant way. And this may be because there was a belief that the UK might change its mind about leaving the EU during the negotiation process, or would do so in a way which left open the possibility of having little change or a very close relationship. What is interesting is that even after the UK actually left Europe at the end of January, we haven't seen a significant fragmentation of liquidity or a shift away from primary sources of liquidity in the UK. I would also say that from a market perspective, European investors continue to clear derivatives in UK CCPs and to a lesser extent in US CCPs. And this is probably due to stickiness of liquidity. Markets with greater depth of liquidity attract more participants who in turn provide more liquidity, and so on and so forth. But this may change, and it all depends on what happens next. As Paulina mentioned, there is a fourth round of negotiation which would take place next week. And I would just say that it's unclear how successful it is going to be. I'm certainly not going to be making any prediction, although I wish both sides good luck in the negotiations. But just focusing on the financial sector, it is a fact that at the present time, the UK and the European regulation is fully aligned, and it should be considered equivalent by regulators. But the world is not static. Both from the UK, the European side will be developing their rule sets independently for years to come, and new ways of cooperating and dealing with divergences will need to be found. So I think at the heart of the forward relationship, there is obviously the degree of integration one wants to maintain, but also new mechanisms needs to be found to deal with divergence as they evolve over time and mitigate its impact. So it is, as David was just mentioning, it is obviously a challenge because we start from a fully integrated, fully aligned rule set, and now we are evolving through trade negotiations to a different kind of arrangement. But really new mechanisms needs to be found to establish to ensure that there is, to minimize the amount of friction and fragmentation between the two markets.
Okay, thank you. Pauline, I'm going to turn back to you, and I'm going to call on a little bit of your past jobs, which is, all right, so Martine was talking about financial services. I know you've worked a lot on financial services at DG FISMA as well as other positions in your career. How do you see it? So Martine just kind of laid out what she was thinking about. How do you see it from a negotiator standpoint? That's kind of question one. And then kind of to David's point, David was a little not overly optimistic, shall we say, about getting all of this done by December of this year. How do you see it? Because obviously that's the UK government said this is what we really want to do. We really want to try to get this done. In the EU, are you seeing it the same way? Do you think like this is possible or it's not possible? I know those are two very different questions, but I wanted to play off of what David and Martine had said. If you can do that.
Of course, thank you. I start with David's point. The time is short. Now there is a possibility in the withdrawal agreement, which is to agree to extend the transition period, which is the period that the UK is in now. So a third country, no longer an EU member state, but still subject to all the European Union rules. There is the possibility to agree jointly, the two sides, EU and UK, before the 30th of June to prolong this period. So we could get ourselves more time if we jointly agreed to do so. Now, of course, our UK counterparts have been made very, very clear publicly on repeated occasions that there is no interest at all in this kind of extension. If the EU were to ask for it, the UK would not accept it, which means that we have the time that we now have in front of us. Again, of course, this time pressure has not been put on the process by the European Union, but it's a situation in which we are. Now, Mr. Barnier has, as the chief negotiator, a clear mandate, which is to try to reach an agreement in the time we have. So that is, of course, what we will try to do. And we will, as I mentioned, we will have to see where we are after next round. Now, as David was saying, it is, of course, indeed very unusual that we are starting in a fully integrated position. We are moving towards, instead of trying to have an agreement to come closer and closer, it's exactly the opposite. But this is the reality with which we have to work. I also want to make the point that there is, in the area of free trade agreements, there is never such a thing as a precedent, because, of course, we have agreements with Canada, with Japan, with South Korea and others, but every country needs to be looked at in its particular, very specific situation. And that's, of course, the situation with the UK as well. Now, on the point on financial services and the how to take that forward and what the future will look like. Then what is interesting in the area of financial services is that we work on the EU side with the instrument called equivalence, which Martin has also referred to, which is not UK specific in any way, because these are rules that exist in parts of our financial service legislation, and we have used them in the past with the US on CPCPs, with Japan in other areas, and with many others. So this, of course, the process which is available also for our relations with United Kingdom in the future. These equivalence processes are not part of negotiations. It's not financial services as such will not be, market access issues will not be dealt with in the free trade agreement, but we will deal with this via equivalence processes. And these equivalence assessments are currently ongoing, as we have committed to do in the political declaration, which I mentioned earlier. Now, what does this mean in practice? I think it's very important, and Martin knows this well, and I'm sure many others as well, that, of course, under all circumstances, the situation will be very different on the 1st of January next year. Equivalence is an instrument. It could be used in certain sectors. In many areas, we don't have any equivalence instrument. For example, in the area of banking, there is no equivalence for market access, which means that under all circumstances, as of next year, UK banks that want to be active on the continent will have to establish or provide services under the relevant national rules. So there will be no passport. And this is true for insurance. This is true for asset managers. This is true in very many areas. So I hear what Martin is saying in terms of avoiding fragmentation and keeping liquidity and in London and all that. But the reality is that the relationship will be very different as of 1st of January next year, regardless of the possibilities of equivalence, and that is what the sector needs to be prepared for. And as was mentioned, a lot of preparation went into no deal, and it's of course important that these kind of preparations are taken up again. I mean, long term, of course, this has also a lot to do with continuing to advance on banking union, continuing to advance on capital market union. We have today a financial sector in Europe which is extremely dependent on London for historical reasons. It's the way the system works today. But of course, long term, we need to have a reflection on what kind of dependence one would want to have on a third country on these very important financial stability matters.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Dave, I'm going to turn to you as the former ambassador to the United States. So I'm going to switch subjects here, although obviously if you have something that you want to add on to what Paulina was just saying on the Brexit, please do. The question I have is, so the U.S. and the EU, there's been some divergence over the last few years. Every now and then it comes together on a few issues, but there does seem to be more on the divergent side, whether it is the Airbus-Boeing dispute or some other disputes. How do you see this going forward? I know that there's been some talk about like they come together on some sort of a trade agreement. I think that seems a little bit strange to me, but maybe I'm just misreading the situation. How do you see the situation between the EU and the US on trade and other kind of niggling issues on the international economic scene?
Well, thanks, Clay. At the risk of having the last word on Brexit, let me just say that I think, what the people watching need to take away, in my view, if you listen carefully to what we've all been saying, is no deal outcome at the end of this year is, for the moment, probably the more likely of all the possibilities you can see. That's for me to say. Others will probably not want to agree, but that's my view. And I think people, economic operators, businesses need to bear that in mind and be working in that direction. On transatlantic trade, yes, it's clear that we've had a lot of tension. We had the very historic agreement between President Juncker last year and President Trump in the Oval Office, which brought us a truce, which is still there. The exception to that has been the Airbus-Boeing row, which is a product of WTO actions, and the US has legally imposed retaliatory tariffs on the EU in accordance with what the WTO has enabled. The EU will presumably do the same when it gets a similar judgment in the opposite direction in a few months' time. So, that's a kind of zero-sum game, probably. And in the meantime, under the new commission, Ursula von der Leyen and Phil Hogan, the trade commissioner, have been talking with President Trump and Bob Lighthizer, USTR, Ambassador Lighthizer, about trying to find some new elements of agreement for the issues which continue to divide us, which are known, as you say, Airbus-Boeing, the more general issue of agricultural trade, which is a very sensitive issue, particularly in Congress. The COVID-19 crisis has kind of driven that a little bit off the top of the agenda, also prevented some physical trips taking place. President von der Leyen was slated at some point to go to Washington. Hogan was due to go back, having been several times. That's all been cancelled. And of course, the psychic energy and the bandwidth on both sides of the Atlantic has been rather domestically focused, inevitably. I would not expect, frankly, at this point, a major breakthrough between now and the US election. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's going to be very difficult. Increasingly, the US is in full election mode. We're heading into the summer. It's going to be tricky, and the EU preoccupations are what we know. Looking ahead at the general election, I think it's very important for Europeans to understand. I don't know what the result of the election will be, but I don't believe that a change of president or a change of administration will necessarily bring a dramatic change in the substance of the US position on these issues. It may bring a change of style, of tone, but I think the US is still going to continue to feel, rightly or wrongly, that it is not completely fairly treated in trade with the EU. The EU will not agree with that, but it's going to have to deal with that issue, and we are going to have to try to find some accommodation, either with a Trump 2 administration or with a Biden 1, depending on what the American people decide.
Okay. And I did hear you on Brexit, so I will, if Martine wants to add on to David's, again, not highly optimistic viewpoint on the December timeline, I'll let her do that. But I'm going to also, Martine, so related to the EU-US tension or also discussion, is the fact that there is some discussion about the US and the UK coming together and doing some sort of a trade agreement, including one even that could be done over the next few months. Again, something that seems a little bit tough for me to comprehend, but why not? And so as a firm that is headquartered in the United States, You work out of the UK. What do you see? Do you see that coming together? And how do you see it coming together on the financial services front? You mentioned the idea about equivalence with the EU. The United States is not exactly known for being always wonderful about figuring out how to do equivalence either. So how do you see it between the United States and the United Kingdom on this issue?
Yeah. So, both the UK and the US have been very public in terms of their desire to strike a bilateral trade agreement. And we've heard the negotiation have stepped up in recent weeks, very constructive statements coming from both sides. But as you rightly pointed out, it would be very challenging ahead of the US elections to reach a comprehensive agreement. Obviously, 6 months to go. There is a bandwidth issue potentially on both sides. And a comprehensive trade agreement will need to be approved by Congress. So that's very clear. There is very little time for that. Leaving the timing and the process standpoint, what are the key challenges in terms of substance? Whilst both sides see benefits in closer trade ties, we have to recognize the US has great ambitions. Agriculture was already mentioned, pharmaceutical in terms of access for pharmaceutical companies to the UK market, challenging the UK National Health System reference price system for pharmaceutical products. And the point I would say is that anything related to the UK national system is politically sensitive. And if anything, with the pandemic, it has become even more sensitive politically. And I think one of the UK objectives would be to try to keep that off the table. There are also stress points in the UK-US relationship: digital taxation, 5G network, privacy standards, just to name a few. That said, the UK is very keen to diversify trading partners. And I think although they would deny that, but I think there is definitely some who see benefits as a way of leveraging the discussion with Europe. And politically, the Prime Minister would get some benefits if something was reached, but we've already kind of agreed this is nearly impossible. So I guess the question, is there a scope for a mini deal? Is there a scope for both parties shifting gears, and trying to have an agreement stage, striking a mini deal? We haven't seen any indication of that happening either on the UK or on the US side, no discussion of that. But we must keep in mind that the UK is quite keen to advance the negotiations. And if that were to be something the UK were keen to pursue, the US private sector, the Congress are not necessarily keen on that. Whether they would block it, this is a question that remains. So basically, like you, not very optimistic about any comprehensive trade agreement being reached, certainly this side of the US elections. The question is there scope to progress and agree some sectoral or mini deal? I don't see anything coming on financial services at this stage either.
Okay. No, that's helpful. And so, Paulina, I know that this isn't your day-to-day job, but how do you well, I guess two things. One is let's look at the kind of what Martine was saying about the US-UK. Well, I'll just put it bluntly. So does that get the UK some leverage with you guys? And that's point one. And then, but related is kind of how do the relationship between the EU and the US, does it have any bearing on how you're trying to think through this negotiation with the UK going forward? And if not, I mean, I totally get that, but I just wanted to, I know that you have to follow what's happening on that front as well. And so just wondering your perspective.
No, of course, absolutely. I think a lot has been said by David and Martine, and I'm not going to, let's say, speculate on the EU, on the US UK negotiations. It's clear that we, of course, follow that with interest. I mean, we saw the let's say the position paper that the UK published on the positions that it was going to take in its negotiations with the US already a time back. And of course, as has been mentioned, there have been a lot of, let's say, quite a lot of public statements around this. There's also a rather noticeable internal UK debate on some of the issues around food safety, GMO and GMOs and all that. Now, I think from the perspective of our negotiations, it is of course legitimate and absolutely normal that the UK, having left the European Union, is searching and trying to put in place trade relations with important third countries like the United States. I think that is absolutely, as I said, legitimate and normal. There is no direct link to what we are doing, but of course we are trying to follow what is going on. Now, I think though that these two agreements are not really comparable. If we look at the closeness, the trade flows, the exchanges between the UK and the European Union compared to the UK and US, it's a very different situation. I mean, we here come from a situation where we had the EU and UK fully integrated economies for 47 years with a very big proportion of UK exports going to the European Union. So I think the situations are quite different. I mean, it's two interesting processes running in parallel, but I think, let's say, the parameters around these two trade negotiations are extremely different.
I'm going to follow up on something. This is actually a question that we got from the audience. I think a couple of words got cut off, but I think I understand what the person was trying to ask. So Pauline, it's going to go to you, and then Martine, I think I'm going to ask you to comment. So equivalence assessments. So right now, the UK and the EU are equivalent from a financial services perspective. Going forward, obviously, assuming everything works the way people are thinking, there will be at least as you said, the passporting will be over, and so therefore there will be some sort of way of doing equivalence going forward. But how that evolves is kind of the big question, and how decisions are making. Is there a way that you guys are trying to think about how to do that, so that you prevent the thing that we've also been trying to prevent since the financial crisis, which is a dramatic market fragmentation happening? So I think that was the question. As I said, a little bit got cut off in translation, but Pauline, if maybe you can try to hit upon that issue.
Of course. No, absolutely. I mean, I think first of all, we should bear in mind that when we speak about the equivalence assessment, it's not about, let's say, one global financial service equivalence, where we would say that now in all sectors where we have equivalence empowerments, there is a global general equivalence for the UK financial sector. One always needs to go sector by sector, legislative piece by legislative piece. As I mentioned, there is no market access equivalence in areas like banking and insurance. So what you have to do and what we are doing is a really sector by sector assessment of the situation in the UK in that particular legal sector, be it audit, be it credit rating agencies, be it anything else. Now, indeed, as you rightly say, an interesting and important element of here is, of course, not so much what the rules look like today, because today the UK is still in the internal market. It still applies the financial services EU legislation across the piece. So you would expect to find that a lot of things are very, very equivalent. They should be the same. So the real interesting issue here is, of course, what happens next year when the UK is no longer subject to this legislation, and of course has its regulatory freedom to regulate various segments of the financial services sector in a different way. So this is something that needs to be looked at. This is something that we always ask in the kind of questionnaires that we send to third countries when we are in the process of doing this kind of assessment. Now, we should bear in mind, of course, that equivalence, let's say the equivalence toolbox is a rather large one. So there is a possibility to withdraw equivalence if a certain, let's say, if regulation were to evolve so that it would no longer be equivalent.
Okay, and then Martine, maybe I know you had mentioned it a little bit in your points, and you're listening to Paulina a little bit. I mean, how are you seeing this? I mean, as a working for an entity that is going to have to think about how equivalence actually works going forward. Do you see any hope that we'll get to a situation where the UK and the EU kind of realize that? I think hopefully that it's in our best interest to have as smooth a transition as possible. I think everybody thinks that, but it's like whether or not that can happen or not is still in question. But well, anyway, how do you think through this equivalence point?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll go back to points I've already alluded to, is that the firms have been preparing for a scenario which is a no-deal Brexit, and also a no equivalence. And I absolutely take Paulina's points that the equivalence is not broad-based; it is for specific segments of the financial sector. And I think so that the first point. The second point is that I'm not going to make any prediction, but I think as I mentioned, the starting point certainly is. Like I said, it's full alignment. It is absolutely identical. And I think one has to take the view whether, like, nobody expect that to be, the case in 5, 10, 20 years. I don't know what's the time scale. But I think it's quite legitimate to consider whether the instrument can be used for countries such as the UK. It's been used for other countries whose regulatory regime is not nearly as aligned as the UK at this point in time. And I think it is a very legitimate or very credible position for the industry to take. But again, to the point I've made, this needs to be managed over time, meaning there's no expectation that both sides will keep this alignment going forward for an extended period of time. And it's important to have a dialogue and mechanisms. And the other point I will make, which is really ties to what we have been talking about, fragmentation, about coordination, a lot of the rulemaking in the financial sector is global. And it's not, this is very important, and this may be, some of the global rulemakings may have been delayed, that was alluded to earlier. But I don't think any of the parties, either the UK or Europe, wants to depart from that. So there is definitely some pressure to keep a high degree of convergence.
Okay. All right. So David, I'm going to turn back to you about, this is more the EU and the US. So one of the questions that we've had, all right, so in the United States right now, there's a lot of anger towards China. And in a variety of different forms, and partially some of it from the COVID-19. I don't know if EU has the same anger, but do you see any ability for, the problems and the tensions that we talked about earlier between the US and EU, do you see a chance for maybe bringing some of that tension down so that the US and EU can work together towards either, I don't know, confronting, and maybe that's too strong a word, China, but at least to work with China as more of a joint operation as opposed to kind of more unilateral? Do you see anything like that going forward, or just kind of thinking about the EU-China relationship?
Yeah, thanks, Clay. Well, no, I think China is, the big question for us all, frankly, beyond what we've just been talking about. I think in an ideal world, the US and the EU, and by the way, other like-minded partners like Japan, would be trying to have a coordinated position. Indeed, I vividly remember one of the early meetings between President Juncker and President Trump. President Juncker proposed that. I think it was back in May of 2017. It was not followed up on the US side for various reasons. But I think the key question, Clay, if I may, is revealed by your sort of slip there saying, confrontation or engage. That's what we need to decide. If it seems to many of us on the outside that what the US is currently engaged with is a confrontation and a sort of decoupling with China. Now, there are many people in Europe who are very skeptical of the regime in China. We're not happy about human rights. We're not happy about what's happening in Hong Kong. We're not happy about the way they handled the COVID crisis. I don't think they're responsible for it, but they didn't handle it very well. And we're very unhappy with their trade practices. So we have lots of issues we would like to address and deal with. But we don't think that you can decouple and you can just walk away and have only a confrontation. So I think what we need to get to is a common strategy about where we confront or where we challenge and where we engage, because the European perspective is we have to find a way of working with China. It's too big, it's too important, it's there to stay, it's not going to go away, and we need to find ways to have a more differentiated approach rather than simply saying let's cut as much links as possible and isolate it. So I think that's a difference. I think it may be difficult with this administration, certainly in the run-up to an election. I hope that after the election, whoever is the president of the United States, that we can sit round and say, okay, how do we develop some joint approaches to China, including with our like-minded partners such as Japan. We have the beginnings of that in with the trilateral process with the EU, US, and Japan, focusing mainly on steel and aluminium and subsidies, but hopefully that could be extended further.
Okay, and I'm going to, David, I'm going to stick with you just because I got a question from the audience, which is, so there's been some discussion, I guess, on what to do on medical issues and like whether it's protective equipment, ventilators, and there have been put up, we've seen lots of trade barriers being put up around the globe, including from the EU. And I saw yesterday, it looked like the EU is kind of taking some of those down and saying that was a temporary basis. Is this an area where the EU, forget the United States, the EU and China could work together to try to actually start thinking about, we have a COVID-19 crisis. China makes a lot of the either pharmaceutical issues or medical equipment. The EU makes some of it as well. Is there a way to come together as opposed to dividing each other apart, which sometimes seems to be the tendency?
Well, the EU has actually proposed that we should have, in the context of the WTO and elsewhere, we should have a discussion about how we can deal with these issues in the future, not having trade restrictions, abolishing tariffs, if possible, on medical equipment and other issues. So I think there's a lot to be discussed. I think we need to discuss what this issue of reshoring and repatriation of certain issues involves, or diversification of supply. I don't believe that any country, even one as large as the United States or a trading bloc as large as the European Union, can aim for self-sufficiency. I think this is an illusion. We will need to trade. Maybe we need to look at greater diversification of supply, and that's something we need to talk about. Maybe we need to look at some stockpiling, for example, on a European level, so that we have emergency buffer stocks for things like personal protective equipment. So I think there are many lessons to be learned. I do agree, and I think that's very much the European Union position, that there needs to be an international discussion about how we deal with future pandemics, because let's be frank, this has been awful, but we could have even worse crises coming at us, and we need to put in place the mechanisms and the structures that will enable us all to deal with these in the future, including, by the way, because fortunately it's not there yet, in the developing world and those countries who are least equipped to deal with this kind of crisis if they were to be hit by it. So I think the European Union, with China, with the United States, through the WHO or whatever, and the WTO, if it's a trade issue, would be more than willing to look at how we could have a more integrated global response to this.
Thank you very much.
We are going to have those in the future.
Nope. Thank you. And I misunderstood. I thought I cut you off a little bit there. So we've run to the end of our time. So let me just thank everybody. Thank Paulina, thank Martine, thank David for being so kind and sharing your thoughts and your time with us. Next up, I think, is it flows from the discussion we just had, which is the implications for the integration of the EU financial markets, whether or not we can get rid of some of the market fragmentation within the EU. So again, David, Martine, Paulina, thank you again, and we'll go on to our next part of our program. Thank you.